Ladies and gentlemen, he is the man who killed Seinfeld. In a career that began some 35 years ago with a badly lip-synced version of The Yellow Rose of Texas for a K-Tel record commercial of Mitch Miller's greatest hits. Since then, he's managed to kill 3 series of his own, 4 soap operas. He's guest starred on more than 50 television shows. Not one is still on the air. And during Sweeps, the golden week of television ratings, he managed to take not 1, not 2, but 3 shows off the air in 1 week. Ellen, Seinfeld, and Damon, ladies and gentlemen, the Grim Reaper of television, John OHurley.
All right.
Thank you. Amazing.
Now that's an introduction.
Now that
Indeed.
so that's tough to compete with. So John, speaking of that, you touched on kind of things getting canceled. So let's jump back to 1995, and I think you were part of a show called A Whole New Ball Game when the phone call came from Seinfeld. So tell us how the whole thing came about. Was there an audition? I know you were doing A Whole New Ball Game with actually a lot of kind of Seinfeld characters that were in the
It was quite an all-star cast back then. I'll tell you, talk about people that went on to do much greater things. But we were all assembled on ABC once a week for a really funny show called A Whole New Ball Game, and had a nice cast: Corbin Burnson, Richard Kind, Stephen Tobolowsky, Julia Campbell, all named Seinfeldian. And we got canceled. ABC canceled us on a Wednesday morning. Basically, they called and said, "Don't come to work." We pulled the plug. That's how they do it. And I went out to dinner that night, crying in my beer, trying to take the cancellation as personally as I possibly could. And that evening, Larry David's office called and mentioned that they'd heard about the cancellation, and they had this guest star role on the next episode of Seinfeld. And they said it's something that John could chew up and spit out and have a lot of fun with, and we think it'd be perfect for him. Does he want to do it? Well, I turned to my manager and I said, "Tell him thank you, but no. I'm really licking my wounds over having my series canceled. So I think I'll just let my ego lie in the without any kind of conclusion to it." And so anyway, long story short, my manager never called and canceled. So he got up, and I got up the next morning. He called me and he said, "Listen, just go blow it out of your system. Go have some fun." So I went over there, and they had offered me the role, and they said, "All we want you to do is to make it sound the way the catalog is written, as though what he says comes off his tongue 24/7. So I had never seen the catalog before. They popped the J. Peterman catalog in front of me, and it was about this long adventure story about an Oxford button-down, and I'm sitting there reading it. I go, well, this reminds me of a little bit of a 40s radio drama combined with a bit of a bad Charles Kuralt. And so that was really kind of the origin of J. Peterman, really. He was that kind of a character, and I just kind of pictured him as that kind of lone poet warrior there, standing with his feet curled over the cliffs of Ireland, standing over the North Sea, that type of feel. And sure enough, that worked. They loved it. And but the funny thing was about that first reading is that I remember, and they hadn't finished, they were the most disorganized show on television. They hadn't finished the script. So I didn't know. They said basically he's just going to be involved with Elaine. And there were a couple of funny scenes about me speaking in the tongue of J. Peterman, but no mention of the fact that she was working for me or anything like that. So at the table read, I sat down and I read this thing. And mind you, I'm coming off my own series from 24 hours earlier.
Right.
And I remember calling my manager at the end going, "This is the #1 show on television. It's not." I said, "It's not funny. It's not funny." I didn't laugh once. I said other people were laughing, but I couldn't understand why they were laughing. I realized this is something that I had to grow into, is that Seinfeld didn't read funny. It was funny by the fact that you played every scene seriously. You weren't looking for the jokes, because you won't find them. There were no jokes. Oh, there was a quippy line and a witty comeback every now and then, but essentially by playing the scene for the dramatic stakes that were there, the show became funny. So what you needed were four of the smartest comedic actors to really put that up on its feet, to understand what that new style of comedy really meant. Because, everybody else had come from the Golden Girls style of comedy. That sense of, you set up the joke, set up the joke, and punchline. Wasn't that way. And it was very difficult. It took me a few shows to realize the fact that I had to dig deeper into the character to play him with more depth and more of a higher stakes, that this man really walked his talk, and as absurd as it was. And the more I did that, the more the writers wrote for the character. They realized they could have a lot of fun with him. He wasn't a one-line type of. He was a long-form type of character. So they started writing these ridiculous Peterman monologues,
right,
about him being off in the hinterlands, and following the parody of the catalog, which was kind of a Hemingway-esque type of send-up.
Sure, and to your point, so that was one of my questions going to be. I mean, the way no one defined that better than you. That comedy that you're talking about, the dig into the character and deliver it straight, not as a joke, and it's funny. I mean, that was your character.
Yeah, you can't. That's not a character you can step aside.
Right.
You have to play. You have to play him for what he is. He is the poet warrior.
Right. So when you came out at the end of season 6, and then your next episode was 7 episodes into season 7. Were you aware on how big your run was going to be? I mean, you were in 22 episodes, more than anyone that wasn't a parent or Susan.
No, I really had no. I really had no idea. But it was nice. I think by the second episode, which was the Bosco episode, I knew I was going to return. They told me, because basically at the end of the previous season, she was working for me at the catalog. So I knew that I'd be back. And so I think I was prepared for it. And even to the point where, there were certain, and I didn't know that this was considered taboo, but I would throw lines in left and right. It's like that wonderful scene when George and I are sitting in the Chinese restaurant, and Jerry has already escaped on an excuse built for one, as they say. And I put my arm around George and I say, "Come, George, tonight will just be the Bulls." And that was just really kind of off the top of my head. I thought it was just kind of I always saw him as kind of a swirl of testosterone, so it was just appropriate, I suppose. But I had no experience on the show, so I didn't know that. I was always told, just think something's funny, throw it in. Well, you do that at great risk on Seinfeld, because remember, you have a team of very good writers, and but I was able to put a lot of stuff on the page just by trying it out. I understood, it didn't take long for me to understand that character better than they did. With all of his nooks and crevices, it was kind of fun to play him and let him expand.
So, John, you personally, you personify like old Hollywood, right? You really like command a scene. And that voice, right? I want to hear about the voice. I knew you grew up in Maine. You went to Providence, the Big Red Sox fan, the whole thing. Like, is this your original voice?
By the way, guess what I'm watching right now?
No.
Yeah, it's Grapefruit League time, babies. I've got it on it. I've got it on. Yes, right. Yep.
How they look this year?
Yes. Anyway, I'm sorry. I think it's going to be a magical season. I really do. I think they have so much undiscovered talent on that team, and these young kids. They're leading the league by leaps and bounds in home runs. Their pitchers are really fabulous, and they've so much so that they've sent a couple of them back into AAA to go at least give them some starts. So I think this is going to be a very different. Well, we were last place last year. How could you not be worse?
Actually,
but I think this is a strong team.
While we got baseball top of mind, you were in the finale. Obviously, Keith Hernandez was in the finale. I'm sure you guys probably talked about the '86 World Series, I gather, on the set.
Well, I had known Keith for a while, actually. We had, years before that, we had done a celebrity basketball game together. Um, with a few other of the Mets and the Yankees and a couple of us guys, Bryan Cranston and I, we were soap stars at the time, not on prime time, and so we went over and played this team in Brooklyn, I think, this for a celebrity, show up and play type of team. It was a ragtag militia. We only had like 8 guys, so we were all. And none of us had played basketball in years. And son of a gun, they had a polished team. They had plays that they were running, and they had 20 guys on the bench. And oh my goodness, we ended up winning. And so Keith always remembers that story about the fact that that was probably the greatest athletic achievement from guys that really didn't deserve to be on a basketball court. I think I scored 20-something points that night, which was more than I scored cumulatively in high school and college.
Wow. So you mentioned the soaps, and you kind of had that in your background before Seinfeld. Like I said, I just finished your book. It's okay to miss the bed on the first jump, and you talk about how it's on. If you're going to do something, go for it, right? And you talk about when you first kind of decided I'm going to be an actor and went for it. Maybe you could touch on that kind of journey from that beginning of making that decision through to kind of hitting it big, as far as that, how that goes, sticking with it and that sort of thing.
Well, it's kind of a romantic journey in that regard. I knew at the age of 3 what I wanted to do, to the point where, and I can't tell you why, I just know that it's true. People would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and with a sense of disgust that only a 3-year-old can muster, I would put my hands on my hips. I would point to the little black and white television in the corner of the living room, and I would say, well, I am an actor, so that's what I'm going to be. And it was based on the fact that I would watch Romper Room and the Musketeer Club and and Captain Kangaroo, all of these shows that were kids shows. But I always knew when I was watching television that I was supposed to be there. And there was never any question about that. It was so for me, it was always a sense of how do I connect the dots from age 3 until when I finally had the courage to head to New York in my mid to late 20s there. But what I had was an enormous sense of stage fright. And it's because it meant too much to me. And so I never really set foot on a stage in speaking role until I was in my I think I was my sophomore year in high school when I was finally encouraged by one of the English teachers to go down and audition for the play. Well, I ended up with the lead. And that's all I needed. That was the first time anybody encouraged me to do this, and that was the last time I ever needed it. But the sense of stage fright never disappeared. And again, because it meant too much. And so I went through college. My degree was in theater. My minor was in opera. In voice, and so I learned not only my sense of honing my acting skills, but also my voice as well. Because for an actor who is also a singer, you have to hone your voice because the voice is the musical instrument. It is the transmission. It's the vehicle by which you communicate. And most people today have never studied voice. They don't know how to use their voices. And as a result, they can't stand on a Broadway stage and hit the back of the house with their voice. And so they can't command the stage. I was lucky enough to learn that as part of the craft that I have. So when you comment on my voice being, unique or so, if you were to go back into the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even the 60s, and find these theatrical actors, Humphrey Bogart, all of the Richard Burton, all these people, and they had voices that, these were trained voices. You didn't walk on a stage unless you had your craft down, unless you were a trained, certifiably trained actor. And today, everybody, anybody hangs a shingle out and says, "I'm an actor." If you have a rap song, you're going to be in the next movie. Or it's ridiculous. Everybody, right. People who just aspire to be famous become famous. They become the story. rather than learning how to tell a story.
Right, and you mentioned that's why I brought up you kind of personify old Hollywood, right? You worked at it. I mean, something as simple as name your price, man. Like it's unbelievable. So, tell us a little bit about the set on Seinfeld. And you came along when the show was literally skyrocketing, ratings at an all-time high. But you're also part of the descent when Larry David left. I'm curious what season 8 and 9 were like without Larry versus 6 and 7 when Larry was there. Like, how big of an impact?
You referred to it as a descend. I don't. I actually think the show got better.
Right. All right.
I think it got lighter and more joyful.
Definitely,
I think it got more. For sure. I think it got more absurd.
Yes.
And again, this is from my perspective, and I enjoyed it tremendously. It became a little bit more physical, and I mean, we did things like, let's go back to an episode, the wedding cake episode, which is actually the Frogger episode. I mean, George matriculating, if to use that word, that Frogger machine across the street, mimicking the Frogger game, was a piece of comedic brilliance, not only in its writing, in its conception, but in its execution. I mean, I think that is one of the most perfect Seinfeldian moments that I can ever recall. Who would ever think of creating the Frogger machine, going across a small side street in New York, and then obviously being destroyed by a truck? I mean, it was an absolute piece of comedic brilliance, and Seinfeld was great. But that also came about during those last couple of years, and I think there were so many little tidbits and wonderful scenes that were endemic of that period that I think Seinfeld was really hit its stride. When Jerry says we went out on top, I agree with him. I think we did. I don't know. I understood what you're saying about Larry, because Larry was a comfortable crutch in the show because he was the voice of the show. When I say that, he was the comedic voice. It was always at the end of every scene. He'd have a way, by watching it and the way we were taping it, it'd say, all right, let's go back. All right, let's do this. And then you say this, and then you say that, and then you come in and do. So he did a lot of the kind of the last bit of hopscotch that was going on there. He was able to take scenes that were a little bit flat, if he thought so, and really and do them, but on the run. And that's what he was great at. I mean, he's a genius at improv, and also can think of a thing that he can give you. Unfortunately, he had actors that knew how to digest all of that, and he knew how to speak to actors. So that's genius and genius.
Right.
It was a different environment.
It was a different. I would say your points are exactly right. It was more absurd. It was lighter. And it was more physical. Those perfect way to describe it. To us, it's two different shows almost in that respect. And it sounds like you're articulating that it was almost two different shows when Larry left. He wasn't it. So just depends on what humor you liked better, the dialogue, like slow, driven earlier episodes, or the more absurd, elaborate what ended up being. So it's almost like two different shows in a way. And you mentioned the Frogger. So that has, it's an Entenmann's, which is a great line. You were in so many classics. I'm curious what other ones stick out to you. I mean, for me, I actually like the ones that are less crazy. Like when you just flop on the couch, you're like, oh, they changed the channel guide again. Like that stuff I like more sometimes than the more elaborate JFK golf clubs.
Exactly. Well, I agree with that. I thought the JFK golf clubs was actually kind of a weak episode. I thought it was a little bit too much about props rather than about relationships. That show was funny when the relationships were being tested all the time. That was a little too much about the props, that one particular episode. But I go back and I think even in the wedding cake episode there, when we talk about the Entenmann's and I finally bring Elaine in and sit her down after having seen her tape, the security tape of her doing the dancing and wolfing down the last piece of my priceless wedding cake, and And I say to her, Elaine, do you have any idea what happens to a butter-based frosting after 6 decades in a poorly ventilated British basement? I have a feeling that what you are about to go through will be punishment enough. Dismissed. But it's, just brilliant. Just
what
brilliant.
lines don't you
brilliant?
What lines don't you remember? I mean, yeah, that was pretty good.
Right off the, you got it right off the cuff. It's amazing.
Remember all of because they were so, and many of them were cut from the show. I'm on that show or that platform now, Cameo.com, where people do shout outs for people know what it is. It's the shout out for birthdays and retirements and stuff. Well, what I do is I have kind of squared off a little niche for myself, which is I write these custom monologues for people in the Peterman style. But they're based on all of the stuff that I do, and that's been a lot of fun. But that was the joy of it. Was those monologues were just the best, and so I don't forget them. They're still now part of my menu.
Right. So speaking of Peterman, it's funny. The actual Jay Peterman grew up around the corner from us here in West Nyack, New York. And then I want to get into I know you're now you're a partner with Peterman and you own the company. How'd that whole thing come about? And it sounds like you weren't aware of what the Peterman catalog was until you sat down for the reading and kind of went through the whole thing. But how did the whole relationship with the real Jay Peterman come around? And is he anything like you?
Well, it was no, he's nothing like me. But to his credit, he's a fun man, and I love him dearly. And we've had quite a relationship together over many years. It was during that first full season that they realized that, and People Magazine did a little bit on the character and the fact that this raving lunatic and what have you, and we did a show called Breakfast, and so they were going to fly Peterman out, fly me out, and fly him up from Kentucky, and we were going to meet on the show for the first time. And I had never seen him before, so I didn't know. And they were going to put us together in the show, and they thought that would be fun. And indeed, it was a lot of fun. It was great. I mean, I walked out on stage, and it was like I'm supposed to be meeting my doppelganger, and he looked like a very very charming Kentucky rancher form of Mr. Whipple. He was, had little glasses on. He had his little, his great big Western hat on, and he was outfitted perfectly in Peterman. And I looked at him and I go, wow, looking at a mirror, But it was good, and we developed a wonderful relationship after that. We actually went to dinner that night and had laughed for hours. And I really, I kind of got into the Peterman style of thinking, and he's a great man with an unusual niche in American cataloging and clothing and design. He has some wonderful ideas and created an extraordinary company that grew to hundreds of millions of dollars in value in the late by the end of Seinfeld. Developed some difficulties, and they went Chapter 11. He was able to get the intellectual property rights back about a year later after Seinfeld ended, and he called me and he said, would you like to put the company back together again using our parallel strengths? And I said, I'm on. Where do I send the check? And so I was on the board of directors and part of the company. And it's like, let's face it, I like the role so much, I bought the company.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
Not too many. It's like Marshall McLuhan once said, he said, be very aware because eventually the medium and the message will become indistinguishable. And I am the living example of that.
So getting back to that character that obviously you so well defined, like we said, 22 episodes, and one of the guest stars who really got to work with all of the main four a lot. Julia probably the most, but you did have a lot with Michael and the others, Jason and Jerry. Just curious if you have any stories, maybe working with one of them, on the set in this particular scene or something like that kind of sticks out.
Well, I describe Jason and Julia and Michael and Jerry as the four smartest actors I've ever worked with. Together as an ensemble. I always believed that we could have probably have taped the show as we stood up off the table read, walked over. I think we could have taped the show right there. They were that smart, and we could have saved a lot of rehearsal and everything like that. But they were excellent at the way they defined their characters. So I'll give you three examples. One, Michael Richards was an absolute. I mean, you have to go back to Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin or Dick Van Dyke, even more contemporarily, or Danny Kaye. People that were physical comedians like he was. He would rehearse the Kramer skid stops in Jerry's apartment like he was Baryshnikov. And the Peterman office and the Seinfeld apartment were right next to each other. So I had his door right there, right, and I could see it right from my desk through the other door, through the other door of the office.
Nice.
Privately in the dark, rehearsing that skid stop. Every time he did a show, it had a different cadence to it. And I mean, he was an absolute genius for that. And his character his character choices were just beyond. It's so much fun working with. So they come to Julia, who I think was probably along with Lucille Ball, probably the greatest physical comedian that we have seen. She will do anything to get the laugh. She will go down with the ship, and is evidenced by the fact that she'll self-deprecate to the point of with that crazy Elaine dance. I mean, who would do that?
Right.
And I remember coming back after she had done the episode with the first dance, and then I came on for the next one, and they were all talking about the dance. I said, "What is the dance?" She goes, "I can't." She goes, "I have to show you, like, privately." And so she took me behind one of the sets, and it was like a private lap dance. You know what I mean? But I got the private dance. And worth every penny. But it was, a physical comedian like I have never seen, and truly one of the most gracious people in Hollywood. Absolutely love her, and her husband too, Brad, is just classy people. And finally, I talk about Jason, success of that show, and I'll tell you why. Any other fat act that did that role, and that show would have disappeared into a cultural vacuum. But what Jason understood was that character was fervently and undeniably and passionately mediocre. And he defended it with his life. He swung from the middle rung on the ladder of life, and he wasn't going to change. And you could try to shake him from it, but he's going to stay on the middle rung. But there was a passion to George that made that role pivotal, because everybody else was absurd. You always had Elaine as the Mary Tyler, these kind of surreal Mary Tyler Moore. But the fact that Jason was there playing the fat man, the character within the characters, with such passion and elegance and drive. I mean, you talk about, tour de force acting and defense of his mediocrity with his parents, no matter what it was, he had a joie de vivre that held. I think that was the toughest role in the show, and it was the most brilliantly executed role.
I agree.
We agree for sure.
The chemistry you touched on was unlike any other, and I think the selflessness and letting guest stars like yourself shine are what made the show what it is. So I just want to touch on the
writing. That was the writing. Yeah. Remember, the writers made us look good. Shakespeare said the play is the thing. If it's not on the page, it's not on the stage. The absurdity to be communicated through these guest stars, these crazy guest stars, and allowed that to be the normal for them to have to deal with.
Yep. John, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about Phineas and Ferb, because my daughters absolutely love that show. Your Roger Doofenshmirtz. I just
That is
how
that
came
is
about, and
that
it's
is
completely
that's
out of left field, but I love
Seinfeld.
it. Yes, it is, right?
It is Seinfeld for kids.
Yes, I agree.
Ferb is created by two of the funniest human beings you will ever meet, and they are just I think probably the most innovative, creative talents in Hollywood, and they created this wonderfully absurd show. Whether I'm watching it or not, it's a show that adults want to watch. If we're driving to Palm Springs with my son, we have the grandparents in the back seat with him, and they're watching Phineas and Ferb because it's so enjoyable to watch. It really is just it's the greatest. Forget the kids. It's
really well done,
and forget that I'm in it. I'm just on the show. Absolutely. If you haven't watched Ferb and watch half a dozen episodes, it's just the funniest thing. It'll just make you smile.
Incredible. Thank you so much, John. That was so good. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. A lot of fun.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much,
John. This was
incredible. Go Sox.
Take care. Bye-bye. Yeah, I hope so. Bye-bye now.